Hi, everyone. Today's guest on Business Storytelling is Doug Lipman, a professional storyteller for more than 40 years, founder of Story Dynamics, and author of 3 books on storytelling, and a holder of an amazing Lifetime Achievement Award. And this is like, how can you even be able to get it? Like, it's called Sustained and Explanatory Contributions to Storytelling in North America, Doug Lipman. Doug, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We're doing this to enlarge the storytelling culture. So in Russia, and about storytelling, I recently rewatched actually your TED talk on the strategies of building connection with stories, and I absolutely love your 3 strategies about how the story builds connection. And that's just amazing. So, Doug, just to have a fresh start, could you tell my audience a bit about your background? Like, how did you come to be a storyteller in the first place, and what do you bring to the business in storytelling?
So I as you learned on that TEDx talk, I in 1970 was teaching resistant teens with behavior problems, right? And I was stuck. And when I just happened to tell a story, suddenly we were connected. So, and I've been following that really my whole lifetime since then, with many, many detours. It hasn't been a straight line, but it's been a fun journey. I thought that the story that I told that day, this in the TEDx talk, that I told to the children, I thought that it was actually sort of a part of folk music, because I listened to a record the night before in the folk music shelves. And it just happened that the next day I had this occasion where they needed someone to tell a story. So I told it. But
that's a coincidence.
Total amazing coincidence, right? And throughout the next years, I tended to think of storytelling as part of doing folk music with children. So when you're doing music with children, sometimes you play singing games, sometimes you just sing a song, sometimes you're doing movements, making up verses, and so sometimes you tell a story. So I just did those 2 things together. And then one of my early marketing decisions that made a lot of difference was 1977. I called up a school to say, hey, more performances in your school, right? And they said, oh, we have way too many folk musicians. But across the hall, they're looking for literary resources, and they're dying for storytellers. And so right there on the phone, I made an instantaneous marketing decision. You were going to get songs with stories, but instead you're getting storytelling with songs.
Great. No, that's a twist. Great.
And as it happened, that in the US and to some extent worldwide, there was a storytelling revival beginning, an interest in oral storytelling that had been sort of driven away by print to some extent, and then by television even more strongly. And so suddenly people were like, hey, let's get together and actually tell stories in person. So I happened to be coming to that realization that I was a storyteller just as that was picking up steam where I lived. So very active in what's called the storytelling revival. So from there, in the late 1980s, I was doing I was the keynote person at a 1-day folk story festival. And so I had to do a workshop for teaching people how to do stories, one on coaching people. And then in the evening, I did a 2.5-hour Jewish mystical epic, which is about leadership and hope. It's called The Soul of Hope. And all day long, I noticed that there were these 2 women who weren't wearing jeans. They were dressed a little bit dressed up more than everybody else. And they were smiling the whole time, but they never came up close. They were always in the back. And so when the whole day was over, I'd done my show, I'd done all the workshops, they came up to me and they said, my name is Cheryl DeShantis, my name is Annette Simmons. We want to bring you.
Oh my God!
We want to bring you to the Center for Creative Leadership. And I said, I don't have anything to tell them. No, we want you to do exactly what you did today. How to learn to tell, how to coach, and then tell this story, which is really about leadership, and it's a story they need to hear. So that began many years of collaboration, which in some sense with Annette Simmons is still going on. And it was I was so nervous because it felt like business was another world, right? I had no knowledge of that. But little by little, I learned that, in business, they still put their pants on one leg at a time.
It's so true.
And that in fact, that Cheryl and Annette were right, that what I knew was something they needed to learn. And so that started me on the storytelling and business thing, which I still see as one of the things I'm happy to do. That I used to think was so different. Certainly there are differences, there's different contexts in business, but it's essentially the same thing. You tell stories. When you tell stories, people imagine. When they imagine, they create their own meanings. And when they create their own meanings, then the story becomes something that's unique to them and that they own. And because of that, I'm not trying to get you to believe what I'm saying. I'm just trying to help you believe what you're saying yourself.
Oh, that's deep. So, like, I'm telling your story that you're telling to myself to formulate a new meaning. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. You're imagining it, So when I was telling you about meeting Cheryl, the two women, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You probably had some visual image, maybe, of the two women, right? Standing off, they're dressed a little better than everybody else. They come up, and so you created that image.
Yeah.
Now, if I was giving you an essay, the person who wants to do business storytelling needs to understand A, B, and C. You wouldn't be creating images in the same way.
True.
But since everybody creates their own images, you created your own, and so now you own that. And it's human to make sense of that. So now you're making your own sense of it, which may be similar to someone else's or not. So in a way, storytelling is the advertising tool that every business has dreamed of. You can get people to make your story theirs and to come to their own conclusion about it and find it meaningful for themselves. Right? That's very different from I've got to talk you into it, grab you by the collar and tell you how important this is, and make you, okay, I get it, let me go. You can actually entice people to do the imagining and the meaning making themselves based on something that you're providing for them.
Wow, that's great. That's some good stuff. You know what I'm thinking about? It's that a lot of business people are like not courageous enough. That's my thought after what you've told, because it takes courage to be open to let someone draw their meaning from the story, not make the meaning upon them.
That's right. And there's a lot of situations where there's really a continuum between I want you to get my exact meaning and I want you to be engaged, so I'm willing to let you have your meaning. Right. So if the message is the bus is on fire, get off.
Yeah.
I don't want you to be imagining fire, right? I get off the bus, right?
Sure.
So in that case, we don't want you to interpret the meaning. We want you to accept my meaning and act on it quickly. On the other hand, we talk about, what's the nature of a bus ride?
Oh, that's a great example. Great.
Right? So there, I want you to be more engaged. If I'm selling you buses or bus tickets or something like that, now I really want you to find your own connection and your own meaning, so that you will be motivated to do something.
That's just for a short interruption. I've seen a lot of storytellers, and there truly is a continuum. And some say that they have to say a resolution or like moral or a business point, and they have to state it so that the audience don't get the mix up. Like Sean Callahan says that like major stories like stories about strategy or some changes, they have to state the moral. So it's basically up to the business person to pick whether you should state the moral or not to get you right.
That's right. There's a trade-off between participation and control. If I want you to participate, I got to give you more control.
Great.
In the business, you can say, okay, we're all going to do it this way. No, I don't care. We're doing it this way. And that makes people less inclined to participate. And sometimes that's worth it.
That's true. Great. You know, yes, this differentiation is just lovely. Thank you. Okay, so Doug, I know that you're a storytelling coach, and that's
Yes.
like a combination I absolutely love. Coaching is a big thing here. And
Yeah.
you know, I've seen like brand storytellers and sales storytellers. So could you tell me like shortly, what does a sales storytelling coach do and how does he do it?
Right. So obviously the job is to help people become better storytellers. Now, people understand that job differently. And I think it depends on what you do as a coach, depends on what you think the storyteller's job is. Right, so I just described to you that the job of the storyteller is to stimulate people to imagine in their own way and then make sense of it in their own way, right? And you can hedge that. You can make it, you know, get off the bus and there's a fire.
Okay.
Or you can bring it all the way to imagine your best memory of a bus. But my understanding of what the storyteller does is based on what I said. And one way to think about it is if you think of what I call the storytelling triangle, the three elements of any storytelling event. There's always a story, there's always a teller, and there's always at least one or more listeners, right?
True.
And so the goal of the storyteller is to stimulate the listener to connect to the story. Because if you don't do that, nothing I've said matters. Right?
Great. That's good positioning. That
right?
really clears things out. Great.
And so the paradox is that that's the one relationship in that triangle that the storyteller is not a direct part of.
True.
I have a direct relationship with you as the listener, even though I might have never seen you before. I'm still relating. We're responding to each other. I have a relationship to the story, which, unless I'm improvising, is a story I've been able to develop an extended relationship with over time. But I'm not part of the relationship between you and the story. So how do I entice you to relate to the story, which is actually my fundamental job here? And the way I do that is basically by tugging on my relationship with you and tugging on my relationship with the story in the hopes that I sort of get the kite of your mind to go up toward the story.
Good. Great. Okay.
Right? And so if that's the job, then the tools that I'm using are very indirect tools. So I am not able to take your mind and connect it to the story. I can't make it happen. I can only entice it to happen. And I use my relationship with you, my responses to you. I use the oral language that I'm using to describe the story. And this is very complex communication. There's multiple things going on at once. We're so used to written stuff in contemporary culture that we tend to think that everything is linear. Word 1, word 2, word 3, word 4. But in fact, even in written language, often there's multiple channels broadcasting at once. And certainly in the case of oral or even video storytelling, there's multiple channels. I'm, visual and auditory and the words and the tone of voice and all those things are all simultaneously transmitting. So I am doing something that's too complex to be aware of. Every human knows how to do it. Every human knows when they should say, really? Or really? Right? To explain what they just did, I don't know.
So yeah, like you're working on this counterintuitive part, like the voice and the tone that just tugs the strings to you.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I'm doing things that are too. There's too many things happening too quickly for me to ever consciously be aware of them all. like you can't see me, but my hands are here, I noticed, right? I have been in this position. I don't know how they got there.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Right? You know, I mean, I'm doing this and I didn't mean to do this, but now I'm noticing I'm doing this. What's this about? I don't know. So I did all this, so much of it is unconscious.
Okay.
And to do multiple, and that's the great thing about our unconscious minds. We can do multiple things. George Lakoff, who's a cognitive scientist, says that we think that thinking is linear, but in fact, it's massively multi-parallel. Massively multi-parallel. Our brains are doing thousands, maybe even millions of processing per second. So we can't be aware of it all. And to do your best work, you have to be able to rely on what you're not aware of.
Good one.
Right?
Good one.
So we're using what I call as our creative intelligence. It includes our conscious thoughts and our unconscious thoughts. And so we're using our creative intelligence to entice the listener to connect to the story.
Great.
And so we are part of that process, but we can never force the process. It's just like a farmer. The farmer creates the conditions for the seeds to grow, but the farmer doesn't make the seeds grow.
Yeah.
Having created the conditions, when they do grow, it's a miracle. So
Great.
I'm creating the conditions for you to engage with my story, and I'm doing everything, all the good farming I know how, but it's still a miracle every time.
Yeah. True. You know, that's just great, because I had an interview with Doug Stevenson some while ago, and
Yeah.
you're probably familiar. And you know, what you're saying right now is like very similar to what he's saying, but somehow I see that, like, I don't know if Doug ever sees this, he's gonna be like pissed off or whatever. I see that, like, you're on the light side, like it's a miracle, you have to let it happen with the people, and on the side of the business, like, do it with the people, and it's like the same mechanisms, but I love the two different approaches with two different talks. So yeah, thank you so much.
So if that's the job of the storyteller,
yeah,
right, tug on these things in the hopes that this third thing happens, then the job of the coach has to be in accordance with that. So typically, when you're good at something, say it's storytelling, people come to you and say, "Oh, you're good at storytelling. Charlie over here wants to get better at storytelling. Help him out." So usually you're not aware that you're doing this complex thing. You just think of, okay, here's a story. I think about how I would do the story. Charlie has a story. I'll think about how I would do Charlie's story, and then I share the results with him.
Okay.
Right? And that's helpful as often as a stopped clock is accurate. Twice a day, a clock that says 1:05 is accurate, right? And so sometimes what you're suggesting that Charlie do is actually what he needs in order to get better, but it's coincidental, right? Unconsciously, you may be guided better than that, but you can't know that that's what he needs, especially because you're not, in my mind, solving the right problem. So the problem isn't for me to apply my creative intelligence to Charlie's story, because Charlie has to be free to apply his creative intelligence in every event, to be doing these complex tugs and pulls with the listeners in the story and Charlie's own personality. So I don't want to apply my creative intelligence to Charlie's story. I want to apply my creative intelligence to Charlie's process. In other words, I apply my creative intelligence to the liberating of Charlie's creative intelligence.
Oh, great. So you're affecting not what he's talking about, but how he's presenting the story.
That's right. And what's in the way? What's he's doing well? Which parts are just flowing great? And where does he seem stuck? And so if I tell you, okay, Charlie, here's what you should do. When you get to that part, do this, right? And the problem is that when Charlie gets to that part, maybe people can't see this. maybe they're too far away, right? Or maybe he's in a culture where that means something bad, or right. So Charlie has to be responding uniquely to each context. And if I tell him what to do, I'm actually encouraging him to disengage his own deep sense of what makes sense now.
Great.
I want to be encouraging that. So I have to notice, first of all, what Charlie's strengths are and help him become aware of it, because people say, oh, I know what I'm doing well. But actually, most people don't know what they're doing well. Part of the reason for that is that what you do well is often what's come easy to you, and so it's not marked with effort. Right.
That's deep. That's deep. Great. Thank you.
And there's other reasons why you don't know what you're doing well. Some people are more or less aware of any particular thing, but you can't count on them knowing what they're doing well. And so one of the jobs is the first job as a coach, my first tool is to listen deeply, openly, respectfully, responsively. So I'm just delighted. I'm the delighted listener and listen to whatever you say. Then I'm going to give back, articulate. Would you like to hear some things that you did well? And then I'll say some things, especially looking for things that maybe Charlie says, oh, okay. Right? He's not aware he's been doing, right? Because if you aren't aware you're doing it, it's often that you'll spend time trying to fix it when you don't need to.
Got it.
And again, given the way we're taught, we often have misconceptions of what doing well is, right? But if I can say, when you said that and you did something with your hands, I can't imitate it exactly, but I got the image of the thing you were talking about. So all those things are useful and help Charlie become aware of what he's already doing well so that he won't keep changing it to try to make it better. And then to notice, having done that, then I'm trying to notice what, if anything, is in the way for Charlie. What obstacles is he facing? And there's I could talk for hours on this, but essentially, as a coach, I know that everyone's obstacles are unique. We're all unique people with unique experiences, and what's hard for us and what's easy for us is to some extent unique to us. That said, I've learned from coaching lots and lots of people over the decades that the obstacles can be grouped into 4 basic categories. And the categories are, like I say, everybody's obstacle is unique, but the categories require each a different kind of assistance.
Okay.
So the most familiar obstacle for our society, for our general Western society, is that you need information, right? So maybe you're shouting really loud because you think you have to be a storyteller, you have to make people hear you, right? And then you don't understand that that's actually creating a barrier between us.
Okay.
Right? And so sometimes just says, yes, you do need to be heard, but if you can be heard relaxedly, that'll have great benefits. And sometimes that's all they need to know, right? And they can change based on that. Now, in our educational systems, we act as though needing information is the only obstacle.
Great. Now, there are 3 more groups.
Right. We're pretty good at it, but one thing that we aren't so good at is understanding that when you help someone with information, it needs to be information in the way they can receive it. So first of all, you need to know kind of what they know already, and then do they tend to think in images or in concepts? Do they, there's a lot of variations individually. And so your job is to kind of keep trying to communicate it until you get to that, then you've learned something about how to communicate. So that's just one example of an obstacle. I'll just briefly, the second one is needing more experience of the story.
Got it.
Just live with stories, right? To feel them and understand them and let them resonate through yourself, and because a lot of this is unconscious, so that takes a while.
Okay.
And if that's what you need, no amount of information is going to help you.
No.
Right. So I can help you with that. I can say, tell me more about about the mother. What's she like for you? the bus,
All
what does it
right.
feel like
So
to be on
more
the bus?
practice, more practice.
Right. So just direct their attention to experiencing the story, especially parts that maybe weren't already clear. So that's the second kind of obstacle. The third kind is emotional blocks. Very common that people are afraid when they're telling stories, especially if it matters or it's a big group. It's not the only possible emotion, but it's a common one. And sadly, so much of public speaking instruction and so on tries to get around this by disconnecting us from the audience. So you see that somebody's looking down and they're not looking up at their listeners at all. And in our dominant Western culture, the expectation is that the speaker looks in the eyes of the listener, and the listener looks in the eyes of the speaker. Different cultures are different, right? I was in New Zealand, and the Maori culture is that the speaker averts eyes and the listener averts eyes. Right, neither person looks at the other, right? And in Native American, most of the cultures, the expectation is that the listener looks in the eyes of the teller, but the teller averts eyes. And I asked one Native American teller, do you look in the eyes of your listeners? He said, no, that would be intruding on the privacy of their reactions.
Oh, that's deep.
Right. And in many West African, for example, and some Southern European cultures, the expectation is that the teller looks in the eyes of the listener and the listener averts eyes.
Yeah, notice that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and that's considered impolite to look up. Right. There's all kinds of terrible things that happen in schools where you have someone with one expectation and the student with another, the teacher and the student, and they both, the teacher's saying, pay attention to me, listen to me, meaning I want you to look in my eyes. But for the, say, African heritage student, that listen to me might mean, I better not look up. Right? And so you have this conflict where they're both trying to their best, but neither one understands the cultural difference. So that's all by way of emotion, because many people notice that the teller in a Western circumstance isn't looking at the listeners and understands that they're not doing the expected thing of making eye contact, which is really, I look in your eyes, you look in my eyes.
Yeah.
And so they'll say, well, just look over the edges of them. So what's the problem with that is that they're not looking because they're afraid, because actually making that connection brings up something, right? And so now you're teaching them to not connect as a way of not feeling the feeling. And so when you don't connect, it doesn't work well.
True. Got it.
Right? So we teach people to not connect rather than deal with the feelings. The truth is, you're not really in danger. We don't have recorded examples of people being killed while telling stories, unless you're doing it with, in part of a rally. Down with you. We will prevail. In that case, yes. But in general, we it's not a dangerous profession, but we feel like it is because we've been humiliated or whatever. So you want to deal with the emotions rather than sacrifice connection, right? So emotional blocks. And then the fourth thing, which I will take the time to say because it's one that we're not as aware of, even those who are aware of the first three are not as aware of this one. It's what I call misdirected effort. Misdirected effort, which means you're trying to do something that you think will help, but that is actually making things worse.
Oh, good. Do you have an example of this one?
Yeah, so a typical one in performance storytelling is that people take on a performance voice,
Oh yeah, that's
once upon a time there was, right? And yet there was not, right? And so there are some people for whom that's actually their natural way of speaking, but when you take on a voice that's not your own, it actually creates a distance.
Yeah.
But if you ask the person not to do it, they're not even aware they're doing it. They're doing it unconsciously. I did many decades ago, back in the 80s, I did a video of how to coach storytellers. And I coached a bunch of people on video, and then I made comments. And I remember this one guy who was doing storyteller voice, you know, it was more like, and now we're going to do this, and then we'll do that, right? And it was distancing. That he was talking like, why are you talking like that? and I finally said, would you just don't tell me the story, but just tell me what happens. And immediately he went back into storytelling voice, right? But then I said, no, I don't want, do you hear the difference there? When you were just talking to me, you did this one. As soon as you started on the story again, you did this other thing. And he said, you mean just to tell it, not like a storyteller? Yes, don't tell it like a storyteller. Because his concept of what a storyteller was unconsciously assuming he needs to do this thing, apply this effort that was actually not helping. And so that's the trickiest thing to coach when people are using misdirected effort, because you have to trick them into not using it so that they can then notice. You can say, now that was much better.
Great. I've actually encountered such behavior at my workshops, and now I have a name for it, because I had a very shy colleague who came to the workshop, and she's like exceptionally good with numbers and statistics. She grabbed the structure like the first one in the group, but then she started telling, and she was immediately not shy, but more like aggressive and even, pumping. And we said like, okay, now just tell us the events. So I just mirrored what you are conscious about, and thank you so much for sharing. That's great.
You're welcome.
That's great.
So that's the job of the coach, is to help the people notice what they're doing well, notice where their blocks are, help them with their blocks in a way that's appropriate for each kind of block.
Okay, great. That's like a really broad and interesting answer. Thank you for so many details. Okay, we could be a bit shorter for the next questions, but it's an amazing experience. So thank you so much anyway.
You're welcome.
Okay, I know that you've been doing this for a whole lot of time, and there must have been insights for you on storytelling. And I know that you're talking about that, like everyone has to find their voice, but we'll get to that. First, I want to hear like, what are your key insights, like one or two, since that time?
Well, I began, like most people, telling stories without much awareness of what I was doing. I had the good fortune that my dad not only told stories a lot, he was Jewish, and so like many Jews, he teaches Jews. And there's a Jewish joke that's where somebody goes to the rabbi and says, why do you always answer our questions with a story? And the rabbi says, good question. Reminds me of a story.
That's a good one.
So that's part of that Eastern European Jewish culture. And so I had the benefit of that. And he also, unlike many, listened to my stories out of me. He was delighted to hear me, and he would say, yeah? He would encourage me. And if I got stuck or something, he'd say, well, you went around the corner and you saw all these kids looking like they wanted to fight. What'd you do? And so he'd help me keep back in the story. So I got a lot of good unconscious training right away.
Great.
But the insights that I have, you asked me this question in advance, what are some 3 insights?
Yeah.
And I thought carefully about it. The first one is that stories are the primary way humans have of communicating experience.
Got it.
So back on the African savannah, before there was storytelling, your uncle had an encounter with a saber-toothed tiger and was able to trick it. Unless you were there with your uncle, you couldn't experience it with him.
True.
But after the advent of storytelling, then that night your uncle could draw everybody around the fire and tell the story. And we know now that when he was talking about running from the tiger, some of the same parts of his brain were lighting up as when he was actually running. And when you were listening to your uncle, some of those same parts of your brain were lighting up. So storytellers give us, on the sensory level, an actual experience of someone else's brain state. experience of someone else's experience. It's not exact, but it's way more than we have in any other form. And so that sharing of experience, I mean, think of how much advantage that was for survival.
Yeah.
Right? Because, among other things, you want to experience it with them, but your uncle could tell everybody. But not only that, you want to practice. If something's going to save your life, you don't want to do it for the first time when your life's in danger. You want to practice offline a lot. And you can do that every time. If he tells it the next day and the next day and the next day, every time you're experiencing and you're practicing in your neural networks that experience. So the first thing is that what storytelling does better than any other natural human mode is to convey experience. And so that means that it's different from conceptual talk. It has a different strength. The second thing I realized, and I learned this because I studied music with Hungarian music teachers, and Hungarian music teachers have a dictum that they don't teach you a concept about music until you've fully experienced it, and in a rich way that you can vary it, and you can respond to it differently. You can you can, if you're learning like kindergartners do the concept of pulse, you've already experienced what it's like to keep the pulse with your hands, but also with your hand, with walking, like, to make it go faster and slower and all these things. So you learn to not to experience it passively, but to experience it actively. And so stories are so in order to teach a concept, you first have to have people have the experience, and then you name the concept. So sometimes when you're doing a lecture or a presentation, you can give people a direct experience of something. Like, Amy Cuddy, did you ever see her TED talk about power pose, right?
Yeah.
So in her TED talk, she doesn't do it. Have the people do the power pose. But I'm sure when she does a 3-hour workshop, she does, because you can really get an experience of the power pose while you're listening. But most things you cannot experience while someone's talking to you about it. But a story can give you the virtual.
Great.
So when I'm going to explain a concept, I don't want to name the concept beforehand, because if you don't know what I mean, you'll make up something, and now you've got to unlearn it. Instead, I'll try to give you an experience, directly if I can, but otherwise indirectly through a story. So that stories are great for experiencing how that relates to concepts. And then the third thing is that our society has been sort of infected by what I think of as the industrial model. There's interchangeable parts. And many people do this. It's not bad by itself, but you have to be aware of what you're doing when you do it. The idea that, okay, you want to tell a story, you need to have a character, a conflict, of this and of that, right? And so it sounds like, and the temptation is to sort of assemble parts, right? And the problem with that is that stories naturally in human life are not constructed, they're grown. And so the organic growing method is more applicable in my mind. So if you assume you have this mechanical method in your mind, and you in an extreme case, and you love roses because you like the smell and you want to have, so you might go on the internet and look up the parts of a rose, and you see that they have petals and stamens and polyxes and whatever else they have. And then you say, well, obviously what I should do is I should gather some and put them together, right? And if you did that, you get something that resembles a rose, right? It just wouldn't have the sheen of life, and it wouldn't have an odor that stimulates the ancient smell centers of your brain. It would lack that quality of aliveness. So that isn't how you make a rose. How you make a rose is you get a rose seed, right? The thing is, a rose seed doesn't have stamens, leaves, petals, and so on. It doesn't even look anything like a rose. Do you know a rose seed? Do you even know where they are?
Yeah.
They're in the hips of the rose, and if you open the rose hip, it looks like a little sort of shrunken piece of garlic.
Yeah.
right? That's the rose. So you could look a long time for something with petals and leaves and everything, and throw thousands of rose seeds. The same thing is true of stories. A story seed does not look like a defined story. And so it's easy to compare your story seed, some episode or some idea or some image you have, to other people's finished stories and think, I don't have a story. That's not a story. When in fact, if you use the natural way, which is to imagine it, tell it to people, respond to their response, and then do that a lot of times, you begin to grow. And there's ways to accelerate that natural way, but that's the natural conversation method that people have been using ever since.
Okay.
And so I could talk a long time on this, but there's a lot of unconscious things we do, and so we don't want to short circuit those unconscious things. And so when we try to make an assembly project, we short circuit those things. So we want to do things that can accelerate that process. One of them is offering a verbal appreciation. When you tell in conversation, people will appreciate, they'll smile, they say that's a good one, or maybe later on say, oh, tell them the one about, right?
Yeah.
Appreciation. But you can actually ask your helping listeners to give you appreciation until you make it systematic. And if imagining is like germinating a seed, and listening is like having the sunlight shine on the germinated seed, and then getting appreciations is like watering the plant. You can plant something in your yard and wait for the rain to come. It'll get watered, but you're leaving it to chance. But if you systematically water it, then you'll know it'll get watered.
Great, that's a good metaphor. Thank you.
So that's the third big thing that I feel like I've learned over the years.
Thank you. We still have a bit of time, so then my next question would be, you have a note in your book that like there's no right way to tell a story, and you've actually we've just discussed it. So basically, what, like a short question here with a short answer: how does business take this approach as like there's no right way to tell a story? So like, how do they take it? How could you comment on it?
Well, I think that it's not foreign to business, right? Because there's there's a word I'm trying. It's kind of a dialectic in advertising, say, and in marketing, which is that you try something, it works, and then that becomes old hat, and then you have to try something different from it.
Yeah.
And then that works, that becomes old hat, and then you keep doing that. So there's a continual need to create freshness, but the freshness depends on what the other person has already gotten used to. So from that point of view, the right way for your audience, for your setting, and for your goals is always changing.
Good.
Because it, novelty is one of the ways that we get attention. And when you keep using the same technique, it's no longer novel, it doesn't work. So now you've got to do something different.
Okay, so got it.
Yeah. So there is no right way to tell a story, but there's a way that's most effective for you, given you who you are, what your goals are, the context, and who your listeners are.
Great, thank you. That's like a small part of something stable in an unstable world of storytelling. Great.
Exactly. Right.
Okay, Doug. Just to wrap it up, I have two questions that I ask all the storytellers I encounter, and I get different answers. So your opinion on those. First one, what would be your advice for people who want to develop their storytelling skills and they are like on the first steps of this path?
My advice is to find people who will listen to you for your sake, so that you can experience relating to them through a story you're working on without having to command their attention. Normally you would do it with a friend or the co-worker at work or something like that. And you would have to be able to do well enough to command their attention, make them listen to you.
Right.
High bar, right? And so if you can let your little bitty seed of the story not have to hold itself against strong winds, but to grow protected for a while, so that then later it will be strong enough to grow against strong winds. The way you do that is by asking people to, can you listen to me for 5 minutes or 15 minutes? Or I have people who we listen to, we take turns listening to each other for an hour. And, and so you get somebody who will listen for your sake. And so you don't have to do it well yet, but they will listen to you delightedly, and they will offer you appreciations. And maybe if you want, they'll ask you, so what is this about for you? Or what do you love about this? And that process, I get to grow the story offline until it's strong enough to stand the forces of being online.
Great. So I hear two parts in this one: find the right partner and imagine and tell. Like not live in the conversation, live in the story.
That's right. And remember that, that having a partner is essential, because if you're telling to a partner, you're practicing communicating.
Yeah.
If you're telling alone in the room, which sometimes makes sense, but if you do it too much, you're practicing not communicating.
True. I love that storytelling in your approach is always a dialogue, and that's what I'm used to doing. Great. Okay, second question, and that's just my favorite one. Could you finish the phrase? It takes one thing and one thing only to get from a good story to a great story, and that one thing is.
Okay, so I'm not going to be happy with there only being one thing.
I know.
But there is one process
that
will reliably work, and it's the process I just described, where you get listeners and repeat it. Just telling it once is not enough. There's a woman who is on the faculty of the law school. She's asked me not to use her name, so I call her Ruth because that's not her name. And she had the job of helping second-year law students defend poor people in real trials. It's not a criminal trial, but it's, they might lose their house or their car or be a victim or something. It really matters. And so it's a big deal, right? You're just a student and you have to do this thing. And she realized that they were pretty good at assembling the right law, the relevant law, but they were dreadful at the opening argument. And the opening argument is really the story of the case from the point of view of your client. And if you can't get that across, the chances of you getting it.
Yeah.
Right. So she tried to get the law school to do a storytelling class, because she'd taken many workshops, in fact, once a year for years, and like a 4-day workshop. And they wouldn't. So she figured out what she could do.
Okay.
So this is called the Ruth method, okay? And if you can't do anything more than this, this is enough to get good storytelling. And so she would suppose that, Cynthia is the law student, and on Thursday, Cynthia is going to go to court. Ruth would say the previous week, come into my office Monday afternoon at 2:00, bring your opening argument and plan to stay about 3 hours. And Cynthia's like, okay, right? Cynthia shows up on Monday, clutching her little written out opening argument, right? And Ruth says, say, tell it to me. No, put it down, face down on the page. You just tell it to me. And Ruth said that first time was always dreadful. But Ruth's a trained appreciator, so she could give some appreciations, maybe just about the law and the concepts of it. And then she'd say, okay, come out. No, leave the paper. Come out in the hall. And then Ruth would accost someone, maybe the custodian walking down the hall, and say, hi, Cynthia here is going to be defending a poor person in court on Thursday. Would you be willing to listen for 5 minutes to her opening argument? And just listen to me say some things that you liked about it. And so Ruth said the first telling like that was still pretty dreadful.
Yeah.
Right? but then she'd find someone else, and then someone else, and then someone else, and then someone else. She said by the fifth time, it was almost always clear and understandable.
Wow.
By
So
the 10th time, it was almost always good. Good enough that if they'd all been that way in the first place, she wouldn't have thought that she needed to do anything. By the 15th time, it was always excellent.
wow, 15 times, really? That's
15.
a long way to go, but still way shorter than a lifetime.
Way shorter than a lifetime. And you can, depending on the length of the story, you may have to break the story into parts and do them each, 10 times or something, and then put them together and do them 5 more times or whatever. But this is a reliable, dependable way that doesn't require on you to have coaches and listeners that can do anything more than listen and appreciate. You don't need a highly trained coach. A highly trained coach can do better, but you can, just with that, you can learn to tell any desired level.
Great, thank you. That's a good advice. So to find a partner and make it practice with the verbal affirmations from the person. Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's right. Because what we tend to do again is to practice not communicating.
Yeah. That's a paradox, right? You're speaking, but you're not communicating. Great.
It's not that it's not okay to do it alone sometimes.
Yeah.
Oh, and I'll tell you one more little free hint here.
Okay.
Which is that there's 3 ways I spend my time when I'm working on a story.
Okay.
Number 1, I sometimes spend it alone, right? And maybe I'll be pacing around saying it, or I'll make an outline or whatever.
Okay.
That's all part of it. And I do that periodically. The thing that I spend the next most amount of time on is telling it to helping listeners, right? And that's so valuable because I find myself saying things I didn't think of before.
Okay.
And the attention of another person will bring stuff out of you. And why take the long, slow way when you can do the short, fast way? And then the third thing is I record every one of those things. Every time I tell a story in practice or in performance, I record it. Now, I don't listen to but 1 in 15 or 20 of those, but I will spend almost the most time listening to myself tell it to someone else. So I told it to a buddy, and now I have that recording. And if that's the most recent recording or the best recording, I'll spend hours, washing the dishes or driving or something, listening to that recording. At that moment, I'm experiencing what it's like to be me, but also what it's like to be the listener.
Great.
And I spontaneously, frequently have ideas like, oh, that's dumb. I can do better than that. And I turn it off and then I say it aloud. And those are insights I wouldn't have if I wasn't able to straddle being the teller and the listener at the same time.
Great. So wow. Good. That's great. Okay, Doug, thank you so much for sharing those insights. And I got 2 advices from you, actually, more than I anticipated. Okay, so just for the wrap up, could you give some context for the folks around here to find you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. And my website is storydynamics.com. And you can remember there's dynamics because I don't believe in static stories. I believe in stories that are evolving and changing and having effects. So storydynamics.com. I have an old site. You'll get it if you go to there. A lot of it's outdated, but a lot of it's good. I have a new site that's store.storydynamics.com. And that started as my new store, and now it's getting more. All my recent articles that I've written in my newsletter and stuff are available there. You can go straight to newsletter sign up by going to storytellingnewsletters.com, which takes you to a page on that store.storydynamics.com.
Okay.
So that's the way, and I'm always happy to you can use the contact form on my websites or find me on Facebook or whatever. I'm happy to. I'm bad at responding on Facebook. I shouldn't mention that because I only look at it once in a while.
But you're good at mail, so yeah.
Email is the best way to reach me, actually.
Okay.
Doug at storydynamics.com. DOUG at storydynamics.com.
Got it. Thank you so much, Doug. And thank you once again for joining us today. This was a pleasure. Thank you.
It was a pleasure for me, and thanks for doing this. It's a service to the storytelling world.
Thank you.